Good morning, ChurchOne. It's good to be with you again. Last week, Lori did a great job in our sermon on Job and really kind of challenging us to think about, in the midst of life's heartbreaks, what we are called to set down. And Job had to set down an awful lot, as Lori pointed out in her sermon. I'm going to be kind of continuing in our time in Job. The book of Job is amongst 5 books in the Old Testament called the wisdom books. 5 gold mines on life with God, each focused on different themes. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job are the names of the 5 books. And they're the kind of books that you don't read once and you're done. They're the kind of books that you just continue to explore. And so in that spirit, even though Lori did a great job of kind of getting us through Job, we're going to continue. I'm going to be here this week, and Sarah's going to be here next week. And we're just kind of let Job speak to us, and let's keep exploring Job together. This week, I want to focus on the end of Job, when Job, who suffers for reasons he doesn't know or understand, but desperately wants answers from God. It's sort of the whole tension in the book, is Job's like, why is this happening to me? And why isn't God telling me? And in the end, towards the end of the book, God finally speaks. And that's where our passage is today. We're the beginning of God's response to Job, and we find it in Job chapter 38. Lori again referenced this specific passage last week, but I'm going to read it again. Job 38, verses 1 to 7. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurement? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. I don't know about you, but one of my pandemic lessons is that I don't suffer well. When it comes to problems, my default, which is I think like a lot of people's defaults, is to either fix it or ignore it. And when you encounter something like a pandemic, especially in the beginning when we were all trying to figure it out, it felt like neither were an option. You couldn't fix it and you couldn't ignore it. And I didn't like that. And I struggled with it. And to my defense, I have a kind of job where I had to continue to talk and inspire people. So it wasn't easy to sort of live through this tension of not knowing what to do. And it was funny, early on, like everybody else, I would video my sermons, and then we would watch them together as a family on Sunday mornings. And after a few weeks of my sermons early on in COVID, my kids would say to me, Dad, I think you need to chill out a little bit on the "are you anxious" kind of messages. Could you preach something else? But it was hard for me, right? I mean, that was kind of what was foremost in all of our minds, but I didn't know what else to say. I really wrestled with, like, what do I say? What does God want us to say? What does God want to speak to us in this moment? And so I decided at some point early on that I would read Job, because here was a guy in a position that he couldn't fix or ignore what was going on. I had read it before, but it had been a while, and so I reread the book of Job. And one of the things, again, that becomes clear in this book, which was sort of mirrored the tension I was feeling a little bit, is that there's a tension in this whole thing when you're like, God, would you just say something? Would you just tell us what's going on? And finally, in Job 38, like I read to you, God speaks, and he speaks up to Job chapter 42. And while I find that speech a powerful speech, and you read it, the poetic stuff, imagery is really strong, and the rest of his speech, we didn't get a chance to read it all. It's a powerful speech by God. But I have to be honest with you. As I read it kind of in my pandemic state, and still as I read it today, I was a little disappointed in God's answer. I think I was disappointed because I kind of wanted answers, and it seems like God's response was just more questions. But this time, instead of me asking the questions, it was God asking the questions, and I felt like saying, God, I don't want questions, I want answers. I read something by a psychologist by the name of John White, and he talked about a time when he was struggling with depression and anxiety. He was a man of faith, and he appreciated the Bible, but he realized the way he was feeling at the time as he was wrestling with his own mental struggles was that it was going to be difficult to read the Bible devotionally. It was difficult for the Bible to sort of lift him up. The Word couldn't do that for him, and so he made a decision. Even though he wasn't connecting emotionally or even spiritually to the Word, he decided that he would continue to plow through the Scriptures and just focus on the content. Just think about the content. Just figure out what it was trying to say without seeing how it made him feel. And he said somehow, just doing that, just trying to wrap his mind around what it was saying, irrespective of where he was emotionally, it was good enough. In a way, it sort of pulled him through as he began to find traction in just trying to get his head around the content of the Scriptures. And that's how I feel a little bit about God's speech in Job that we're in this morning. In the midst of my storm, I really didn't find God's response all that emotionally or spiritually satisfying. But as I've hung in there, as I've wrestled with the content of it, as I've tried to understand what is actually going on here, I've found that it's kind of been enough. And let me tell you, two sources I went to that really helped me wrestle with the content over this past year have been, one, a class I took at St. Mary's Seminary when I was in their Ecumenical Institute. I took a class by a guy named Dr. Stephen Vicchio. He's an absolutely brilliant guy. He's fluent in all these ancient languages. He's one of a world-renowned scholar on the book of Job. He used to have the entire book memorized, which, if you've read the book, that's a big task to memorize that entire thing. But then he had a stroke. And suddenly, it wasn't just an academic question, it was really like a personal question. And his reflections on Job were really impactful for me. I think I was talking to Sarah Batley about it, and I think she may share this in her sermon too, but she took a class by him too, and it was similarly impacted. And so his personal and intellectual perspective on Job really impacted me. And also I read a book by Tim Keller called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. And both of these were helpful with my content. So I throw that out there to kind of know some of the resources that I went to. So here's what it took me a while to see as I wrestled through. Really two things. The first thing is that God showed up. That even though God's speech and the way God initially responds to Job wasn't initially satisfying for me, as I step back and ponder it, there's real significance to the fact that God even bothered to show up at all and speak to Job. One of the problems with the why question, right, which Job was asking and Job's friends were asking, is that there really isn't just one answer. There's 8 answers. And so when we sort of demand that God shows up, or I think there's 8 answers, there might be more, but when we sort of demand like Job did, that God gives him an answer, we sort of miss the fact that there might not be one answer, and there might not be an easy answer, and there might be multiple answers. And so the demanding of an answer is as much as our hearts are crying out for it, might not be as significant as the welcoming of God's presence. Sometimes, like I said, there are many different reasons for suffering, and there are many different answers that God gives. But the problem with looking for answers is we overlook some really important things. And the number one thing that we tend to overlook in our quest for answers is the sufferer themselves. The sufferer becomes sort of a spiritual or intellectual question mark instead of an actual person. And so as I ponder that, and as you think about that, now you see the significance of God actually showing up and speaking to Job as a person. You see, God wasn't just simply interested in an intellectual answer. God remembered the sufferer, and God made himself present. Lori talked last week about Job's friends and how Job's friends initially, I think, decided to comfort him, but then they got frustrated, and Job's suffering became more of an intellectual and theological problem for them and kind of ceased being a person. I don't know if that's ever happened to you when you've suffered and you feel like people, after a while, people's responses and their quest for an answer, you don't find like really satisfying because they don't resonate with your life. I remember when my mom was diagnosed with ovarian cancer at 58 years old. A lot of people here know my mom, and I think they would agree with me that my mom was a great person and a great follower of Jesus. She inspired a lot of people, and so getting cancer at her age was really perplexing, particularly cancer that we weren't going to cure or fix. And so I would often find myself wondering and questioning, and one well-meaning answer I would often get from people was that people would say to me, well, God only gives people what he knows they can handle. And I guess, in a way, what they were saying, and I even appreciated to a degree, was that, my mom was a person of great character and could bear great suffering. And I appreciate the compliment towards my mom, but I do remember thinking, and still do, that if my mom got cancer because of her character, I would rather she be shallow, superficial, and healthy. You see, when you begin to just treat things as an intellectual problem and you lose sight of the actual person, something gets lost. And God didn't lose that with Job. God actually made himself available to Job. So even if God's answers weren't sufficient, like they were to me, don't overlook the fact that he just plain showed up. My sister-in-law passed away this past May. 56 years old, really difficult battle with cancer, a lot of suffering. Really, I've shared some of that in the past. And I remember after the funeral, sitting down with my brother-in-law and just him sort of reflecting on the story and the challenges that he faced. And he talked about sort of the medical journey and the feeling of just sort of being passed from doctor to doctor to doctor. And sometimes the cry of his heart would just be like, is there any doctor that will just fight for us? Is there any doctor or nurse who would take the time to understand us as people and what we're going through? And I know there wasn't a simple answer to that, and he wasn't blaming or disparaging that, but he longed to have his suffering and his wife's suffering taken seriously as people, When finally some medical professionals showed up and heard what was going on and listened to their story in completion, even though they couldn't solve anything, their mere presence made a big difference. God showed up. God showed up to Job. He showed up in a storm. It's interesting. Storms themselves would have been what they call a trigger event for Job. Job lost all of his children in Job chapter 1 to a storm. And in Job chapter 9, as Job is beginning to wrestle with God, one of his fears, he says it out loud, is, I'm afraid that God will destroy me in a storm. So Job was very anxious about storms, and here God is showing up in a storm. But what's amazing about it, again, if you pay attention, God shows up in a storm, but Job is not destroyed. God, in his holy, majestic, powerful presence, doesn't destroy Job. Instead, he hears Job and he acknowledges Job. This is God in both his holiness and his grace, interacting with Job and meeting him on a personal level. This is powerful stuff. Powerful, powerful stuff. And look at how God speaks again. Go back to the passage. God starts in Job 38, and he asks Job questions. Series of questions. Now again, when you want answers, somebody that asks you questions can often be annoying. But that's because sometimes we underappreciate the power of questions. Anne has been trained in spiritual directions, and one of the things that I appreciate about her training and her work is it has often changed our own conversations. Oftentimes now when I come to Anne with a problem or something I'm wrestling through, instead of giving me a quick answer or whatever, she asks me a few questions. And at first it's sort of frustrating because I might want a quick answer, but the reality is the questions actually get me to better answers. And so when God shows up, and he shows up in his grace and his mercy to Job, and he doesn't destroy him, and he begins to ask Job questions, sometimes don't put it off as like God being rough on him. Maybe God is inviting Job into a greater awareness that he wouldn't have otherwise. God shows up. And again, he asks these questions and does things in Job's life that like Job never would fully understand. And I don't think Job would ever fully understand the extent of why he had to suffer. I don't think Job could have sat down and realized 3,000 years from now we would still be talking about him. But we are. God was doing something in Job's life that Job could never fully comprehend unless his vision of God and life and everything else was broadened. And God begins to do that with Job when he shows up and when he talks to him. So God shows up, but he also does more than that. He allows Job to be taken seriously as a person. I mentioned Dr. Stephen Vicchio, and he was talking one day in this class on God and suffering and Job, and he was commenting on the fact that like he has studied all the different answers to the questions for suffering, and he made a comment that I just thought was really good. He says, I've studied all the answers, and what I'm most struck with, he said, is Jesus' answer to suffering that you see in the Gospels. Jesus, when he encounters suffering in people, doesn't show up with an answer, but a different question. And you know what the question Jesus asks? How can I help? How can I help? Sometimes a better question gets you to a deeper answer, and that better question in a personal encounter with God leads to a depth you couldn't fathom, and I think Job experienced that. I don't know for sure, but I know as I reflect on God's presence in this storm, how significant that was. I think we see that. So God took Job seriously, and my last point is Job took God seriously. There's a lot of wrestling. Job had a lot of questions. Lori did a great job of pointing this out, and he wanted something from God that he was not getting. But here's the thing that you have to understand about the book of Job. It's all a prayer. Job's dialogues, Job's ranting against God, Job's all of this stuff. Job, even though he's frustrated with God, Job never stops engaging with God. Job never stops crying out to God. Even when God isn't doing what he wants him to do, even when God isn't providing the answers he wants, Job continues to engage with God. Job is praying in his lamenting and his frustration and all of that stuff. Tim Keller says, even in his laments, Job never stops praying. This whole book is ultimately addressed to God by Job. And God vindicates Job in the end. He doesn't vindicate him by answering his questions, but he vindicates Job for his persistence in pursuing God. Suffering didn't draw Job away from God, but to him. Being honest with God about how you're feeling is a really important thing to do. We don't often think of it that way, but it's important. Psalm 42, verses 4-6, the psalmist says, these things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went with the throng and led them in the procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. The psalmist is saying, I remember when I was praising you, God, and thanking you and all this stuff, and I was leading the charge, but now he's down, and he feels it in his soul. And in verse 5, he says this, why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God. My soul is cast down within me. Therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon and of Mount Mizar. The psalmist is being honest with God about how he feels. Even though at times he wanted to praise God, now he feels down, broken. It's not going like he wants, but yet he doesn't let that stop him from engaging with God. And that's what Job does here. The psalmist and Job kept showing up. What a powerful testimony. What an amazing invitation from the God of the universe for us to continue to show up, even in our despair, even in our confusion, even in our heartbreak. A few years ago, I took a class on family systems theory. It was a different class. It wasn't led by this Dr. Vicchio, but it was really helpful. Family systems theory is all about family dynamics and all that kind of stuff. And I remember one thing the professor said at one time. He said, most family issues, this is what he said, most family issues can't be talked through. I remember thinking like, huh? Like I thought talking about everything was, like getting to the bottom of all this stuff, like it really is what we need to do. And he said, not a lot of times with families. He said, not that there's anything wrong with discussions, but have you ever gone into a family discussion thinking, if we could just all talk this through and get on the same page, like everything will be okay? And how many times do you emerge from those discussions more confused and more perplexed than when you went in? Very often the discussion and the search for the answer feels more like nailing Jell-O to the wall than getting clarity that you want. See, when it comes to really deep issues and really profound challenges, discussion isn't enough. Continuing to show up is a lot more important. And what my professor was saying is, don't put your hope in a discussion. The strength of a family, it's the capacity to continue to show up for one another, even in the midst of confusion, heartbreak, disappointment. Those families that have learned how to continue to show up develop a persistence and a strength that you'll never get from a conversation. Job showed up. God showed up. The conversation, like I said in the beginning of my sermon, might kind of be disappointing for those of us that wanted a more profound answer. But maybe we shouldn't look to the conversation. Maybe we should look to the fact that both God and Job were present to each other, and in doing so, found something they never thought they would find. That might be a lot better answer than the one I was looking for. Let's pray. Lord, I don't know where we find ourselves, and I know when you talk about suffering and the heart, you're touching on deep, deep things. And so I just pray for the capacity for us to stand in this space, to hear your word, to receive this invitation to continue to persist in our questions and our desires to be more connected to you. And more importantly, Lord, may we feel your presence. May we look upon the cross and see that, Lord, you in fact are showing up in our suffering. May we see you in ways we never have before. We ask this all in your name and for your sake.